Eric's.
Omar.
So close. Brandon can fix that audio because, folks, iron culture is blowing up. Trexer's not aware of this, but it was an early part of our lore that we were battling not other fitness podcasts because we're at the tippity top, okay? We only evaluate with iTunes, largely because that's the only place we could read reviews. Spotify, of course, large contingent of people and other podcast platforms, but iTunes is the one we would pay attention to. And as you know, Trex, you could then sort by category. There's health and fitness. Sounds like a great category. And we would see iron culture for the week, ranked 87, whatever. And you go by region, so on and so forth. And it was curious when we started perusing the podcast in health and fitness because some were vaguely related. Well, maybe it was health and fitness, but a lot were sexual health podcasts. And we thought that was cool because I asked Eric, I said, hey, buddy, Helms, how hard is it for you to get another PhD in something that's like kind of related to sexual health or something with that? Also, it seems like a lot of the names are very common, like American names. So it'd be like sex with Dr. Emily, sex with Dr. this, like Susie. And so I'm like sex with Dr. Helms or sex with Eric. Just forget the doctor. Like just let's not be formal. And he said it actually would take me quite a bit of time. But Trexer, we are soaring once again in the rankings. And I'm not saying that it's the Trex Nation, the Trex Army showing up, but I'm also not saying that is the case, you know?
Well, I don't know if you recognize this, but my PhD research was in nitric oxide boosters, which are in like every sexual enhancement product that's sold as a dietary supplement. So I think your little anecdote is a little bit closer than you even bargained for. So maybe we are getting that market.
On top of that, we had another arc that is supposedly a joke, that I have erectile dysfunction. And so, I mean, we have a constant problem, and that's someone who can fix it. So while I'm not going to go back to school to get another PhD, when Omar asked me how hard, I can answer a different question. How hard is it to get the PhD? How hard is it? Generally, when you talk to me, now that I am actually a professional in making it harder to see how hard it can be, and that I plan to continue to compete in bodybuilding, natural bodybuilding specifically, I think it'll be really helpful because we will have a consistent arc. We're trying to get more than an arc, if you know what I mean. Something a little more straight to the point, a little more of a clear stream. And I think ultimately there's a synergistic thing that could happen here. We have a problem, we have a solution, and that can really help us climb those ranks. So something to consider.
Well, I love to be part of the solution in whatever that entails.
I will say it certainly has a good ring to it. Sex with Eric's would be the name of it, right? A polyamorous relationship. Come on now. There are a few things I do want to say, though, just so we can get to the actual topic, but people are leaving reviews. We say, okay, Trexer Helms, that we'll read the reviews, and then they leave these lovely 5-star reviews, and they have just been looking at me. Please read me. And a lot of the comments, like I have to give actually a huge, genuine shout out to my boy, Eric Helms, Mr. Doctor Eric Helms, who I already knew was wearing an Icarus shirt, which is weird. I know our Rascal Apparel designs like that. But the pro natural bodybuilder, Eric Helms, I highly implore everyone to check out that episode. I thought that was a deeply personal episode on both of your behalves, of just weaving your own personal story that I think gives a context for people that, they may not have endeavored to either go that far. Their journey might be different, but an insight into both of who you are. And I'll just say on a personal note, Trex, to you, that we spoke like off camera, off air about like where I had like back in a few different things occur and just how annoying that is and your own journey. So the future is bright. I will read one review at a time. I want to hear, gents, your reactions, because as always, we take about, 8 to 10 minutes for the intro. And there are some things that people are saying about that duo episode and the previous one, why bulking is not the answer. My favorite was someone who left a comment 20 minutes in saying bulking is the answer, which I really appreciated. That they must have listened at 5 times speed, which is incredible in and of itself. Nonetheless, let's read the first review. It's fakereviews.com/ad is the name of the user. I should note that. Now,
Good
it is
start.
yeah, it's a good start. 5 stars is what they gave. And folks, I demand now that we have the Trex Nation, the Trex Army, I want to see a fresh review. So the next episode, I get to read it all about Eric Trexler. I know you can do it. Anyways, 5 stars. This is the title of my review. And it goes, Spinoza wrote, emotion, which is suffering, ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it. However, Spinoza did not have the chance to listen to this podcast. If he did, he would understand that there is some suffering that cannot and should never be endured. After listening to each episode of this podcast catalog multiple times, I can be certain that each of these gentlemen take no pride in their work and are here to mislead the greater fitness community. So this is before Trex joined, just to be clear. Fortunately, I do not believe in cancel culture. Rather, I believe in its antithesis. For that reason, I ask everyone here to join me in giving this podcast 5 stars so we can propel Iron Culture to be the biggest podcast our world has ever seen. Only after this has been done will everyone see the true chaos that Umar and Derek have fertilized the fitness industry with.
I'll react to that. I mean, it's good to finally be seen because I'm trying, I don't know about you, Omar, but the way I deal with my sociopathy is I do the best I can to mimic someone who is at least an acceptable human in society. It's hard to gauge what is good when you're as deeply sociopathic as I am. And the downside of that is you just don't really feel understood or seen by most people. So when someone can see the evil behind the fake humanity in your face, it just touches the lack of your soul. And I just feel, I feel like I can imitate feeling good based upon that review. So thank you.
And Omar, do you know where you are when you're at the top just because people find your work so repulsive? You're at the top.
At the top.
So I'm good with it.
We're good with it.
Bring in the 5 stars to spite us because it's still 5 stars. It still counts.
Trex,
boy.
I have a confession before I read the final review that we'll read for today. And that is one of the other reasons besides your, let's say remotely related area, your PhD, that could help us with the sexual health episodes. The other point to bring, besides all your knowledge, who you are, what you've contributed in the space, would be your wrestling credentials. Because my boy Eric Helms, he stays hard, and I just want to state that emphatically, like unrelated. Like I'm talking now combat sports. I don't know what other people would be thinking about. There was a time when we were in Toronto where I said, Eric, I don't like the way this person's looking at our group. Something might go down. And Eric said, I just want you to know there is something wrong with my neck that I think if I get punched once, it's like lights out for me. But the fact that he was willing to step up.
Well, first I said 1, I got your back and I will fight these people.
2,
but
true.
more than
True
likely, the fight will end because immediately I'll be paralyzed from the neck down and everyone will go, oh my God, that got real too quick. So if you think it's worth it, I'll put my body on the line for you.
True, all true. But Trexler, with the wrestling credentials, he's just going to go for that single or double leg. So not only are the 3 of us truly at the top, but we're remaining at the top. If anyone should ever dare challenge us, they stand absolutely 0 chance. Now, final review, and we got to get to the topic. I love this username. I actually haven't read this review, but it's by Sonic the Huge Hog. 5 stars. Come on, our people are good. That's why I want to give them some respect. This podcast really works, is what they said. When I first heard about Iron Culture, I knew I had to try it, but I wasn't sure how I was going to fit another podcast into my busy schedule. After considering this puzzle for a while, I came up with the answer. Instead of listening during the day, I could pipe Iron Culture directly into my muscles while I slept. So right before bed, I placed headphones over my biceps and secured them with rubber bands. Then I queued up 8 hours of Iron Culture and got some shut-eye. When I woke up, I almost couldn't believe how much my arms had grown. I don't know what they talk about in this podcast because I still haven't listened to it with my ears. In parenthesis, at this point, I'm kind of afraid lest I wind up looking like Dumbo, but whatever it is, it's some pretty powerful stuff.
Great to hear that. I mean, however you use it, as long as you're using it responsibly, I support it.
Yeah, check out Mass, where you can read about ischemic preconditioning as well as blood flow restriction training to find out why your arms got that big from a scientific perspective.
Speaking about gents getting absolutely huge, we are joined by co-host Dr. Eric Trexler, And we're talking about something that was certainly, I would say, the talk of the town. I don't know how you feel, Helms. What we're talking, I would need to look up the year. It's been relevant for quite some time, but did it peak like 2012? Like what is Leucine's year? Like what was the time period, Helms? You would know this. You're the elder statesman, and I mean that with respect, actually, in the community. Was it 2012? I kind of remember some sort of time. When did Leucine peak, bro?
Honestly, you got to give some credit to another elder statesman who was actually 1 year my senior and also a IPF Masters world champion, and that is Dr. BioLane. Let's roll. They said I was done, and I am not done because I'm now a Masters world champion. You want to come get me, you better bring a lunch. Dr. Lane Norton, PhD, PhD Nutritional Sciences, and NGA IFPA Pro. And former squat world record holder, silver medalist in the IPF Open, in addition to now being, if I didn't already say it before, not sure I mentioned it, world champion in the Masters.
Well,
this
wait,
man,
yep. So he won the American. I don't know. He's a Masters world champion.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Dude, that's sick. That's sick.
No. You know,
he's a Masters world champion.
My man built it brick by brick. You didn't think he could come back. The haters said it wasn't possible. And he showed them that it was. And he's been showing them that it was possible since the mid-2000s, when he was straight flexed on the forums, when he was doing his PhD thesis specifically on, American PhD dissertation, specifically on the impact of leucine in, at least in an animal model, and noting that it seemed to be the key factor that resulted in increases in muscle protein synthesis and was associated with greater hypertrophy in rats. Been making rats jacked since the mid-2000s, folks. No, but in all seriousness, so like I really do think that at least in the popular space, there was definitely, if you look at the research on leucine, you could find stuff prior to that. But because Lane was one of the first science communicators, and he did his, who was also a practitioner, also like popular in the space, and he did his PhD on this topic and was promoting the concept of, hey, boluses of protein do their thing primarily because, or at least initiating the key with leucine. He was probably the one promoting that. And I'd say it kind of had an era. And I would say 2012 was part of that peak, but it was definitely there in the 2000, I would say 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. There was a sustained peak. So it was almost more like casein than it was whey.
Got it. Trex, were you aware, just before we continue, and I want you to talk all about Leucine, that he is a Masters world champion?
Yeah. I have now become aware of that.
Awesome.
Due to that lovely introduction by Dr. Helms. And it actually kind of, you mentioned people saying that maybe he was done. I've been hearing similar things about me, and I do believe they have a point, I must say. But in the off chance that I'm not done, we'll revisit.
Yes.
And we'll really let them have it.
Phoenix will rise. I can't wait, Trex, for the return. Please continue.
Oh, it's going to be remarkable.
At least they're not saying you have no chance.
I believe they are, but we'll check. We'll double check that. But these people don't know anything about probability or statistics. I mean, that's an amateurish claim to make, in my opinion.
Exactly.
But anyway, what I'm not done with is talking about leucine. And I tell you what, this topic is near and dear to my heart because as we take this walk down memory lane, I mean, when I got into caring about training and caring about nutrition, you start out, you're lifting weights and you say, okay, what can I do to make this even more effective? You start kind of poking around with nutrition. Okay, maybe there's some things I should be paying attention to. The first thing that I started really prioritizing when I was super young, because I got into lifting when I was 12, started thinking about nutrition when I was like 15 probably, maybe even 14. I said, I need to get protein immediately after I train, and it needs to be a protein shake, whey protein powder. So that was the first thing that I held true in nutrition, was immediately after a workout, you need whey protein. The second thing that I held true after that, doing that for a while, was I heard that I need to get fast digesting, quick absorbing carbohydrate right after my workout to replenish my glycogen, to spike my insulin, all that other stuff. Now, the third thing that I believe to be important is the topic of this episode, which is, Helms, like you said, right in that mid to late 2000s range, we started to see it's not just protein that seems to be important for muscle protein synthesis, but it's specifically leucine, right? And so when we look at protein, a dietary source of protein, some of those amino acids are going to be essential amino acids and some are going to be non-essential. And if we look at the essential amino acids, we can break that down even further. And we've got our branch chain amino acids. And boy, did those sell in 2011. But if we look specifically within branch chain amino acids, there are 3 of them, and one of them is leucine. And like Dr. Helms mentioned, the good Dr. Helms, leucine, a lot of this research was indicating that it was playing a particularly important role in stimulating muscle protein synthesis after we ingest a dose of protein. And so what's going on there, the kind of basic understanding was you consume protein, it's got leucine to kind of turn on muscle protein synthesis, and it's got all those other essential amino acids so that we can actually have everything we need to build new muscle proteins. We do that every few hours, day after day after day, and all of a sudden you've built a whole bunch of muscle protein, and now you have bigger muscles. You're filling out that t-shirt better. Okay, so that was kind of, my 3 things that I built my interest in nutrition on. Whey protein immediately after a workout, fast digesting carbs right after training, and then spike your leucine every few hours. And the reason you do it every few hours is because in the research where they found that leucine kind of stimulates this response, they found that there is what they call a refractory period, meaning you can't just keep going back to the well and just say, oh, cool, I'm going to have leucine every 10 minutes and just grow exponentially. You can kind of stimulate this maximal protein synthesis response, and it's difficult to stimulate that again within the next 2 or 3 hours. That's kind of the time estimate. Unfortunately, what we're going to get to in this episode is the fact that the first 3 things that I believe to be important and true in sports nutrition, I no longer believe to be particularly meaningful. Now, I do want to put a massive caveat on the front end of this discussion. The protein stuff immediately after a workout kind of depends, right? It's not a bad idea to get protein around your workout, but I'm sure you guys have covered this in many episodes previously. There's a lot of wiggle room when it comes to protein around a workout. As long as you're having a couple doses somewhere around there, ideally, you're going to be fine. Even if you can only get one, having it somewhere before or after your workout should be totally fine. The carbohydrate stuff for most lifters, just totally irrelevant in a lot of different applications. The science is true. It just doesn't really matter all that much for you doing 3 sets of 12 of bicep curls. You don't really need to flood the zone with a bunch of, glucose immediately. And that brings me to leucine. Now, the big caveat that I want to put out here is that I am not questioning any of the science that has been done to identify leucine as being a really important amino acid for stimulating muscle protein synthesis. That research was good and is good. And the mechanistic findings from that research continues to be true and valid. But the big picture here for all of us who enjoy lifting is not just is the mechanism correct and true, but how much does that actually matter for my day-to-day decisions when it comes to how much protein I eat, what type of protein I eat, and how I am kind of distributing that throughout the day. So how much protein, what type of protein, and how am I timing that throughout the day? So the reason that I am talking all about leucine is because there is a recent paper by Wilkinson and colleagues published this year, 2023, and it was a meta-analysis looking at the relationship between leucine and muscle protein synthesis in the hours after a bout of resistance training. So you could look right after training in the first couple hours, or you could look at the first 6 hours in this kind of broader window after a workout. And they were really testing 2 main hypotheses that are related, but not quite the same. Okay, so one thing that they were looking at or trying to test here was what we call the leucine threshold hypothesis. And so the leucine threshold hypothesis is really about how much leucine is in the meal that you're consuming. The idea is that when you're planning out this meal, you need to exceed a certain threshold of your ingested leucine dose if you want to maximize your muscle protein synthesis response to that protein ingestion. And I've seen different numbers in different places for that. I've seen some people say 2.4 grams of leucine per meal. I've seen people who scale it to body mass. I've seen people who say, why not be safe and go for 3 grams of leucine? But that's really what we're talking about is 2.5, 3 grams of leucine. It's hypothesized that this is the leucine threshold that you need to clear with each dose of protein that you're consuming. You do that every 2 or 3 hours, and you're spiking protein synthesis maximally many times throughout the day. Now, a related hypothesis that's not exactly the same, but is very, very closely related, is the leucine trigger hypothesis. And the main distinction here is that the leucine trigger hypothesis is all about your blood response in terms of leucine concentration. So the leucine trigger hypothesis is saying, basically, yeah, you need to ingest plenty of leucine. We get that. But what you really need to do is make sure that your blood concentration of leucine essentially reaches this kind of trigger point, this maximal spike that is large enough or high enough for you to maximize muscle protein synthesis. And it's basically the distinction that, we can put whatever we want in our mouth and chew and swallow, but ultimately what's happening in the muscle is going to be dictated by what's going on in the bloodstream, right? We need that leucine to actually get out into the bloodstream, reach a high level and peak so that it'll be available to the muscle. So this was a meta-analysis with a bunch of different papers represented. So I know for the leucine threshold analysis specifically, they had 38 studies with 77 interventions. The numbers were, I think, pretty similar for the analysis looking at the leucine trigger hypothesis as well. So big meta-analysis with a bunch of different papers, some young cohorts, some old cohorts. But basically what they were looking at here is like I said, either the first 2 hours or the first 6 hours after ingestion of protein. And to be included in this study, basically there were 2 really important factors. People needed to do a resistance training workout, and they needed to consume a dose of protein with a known amount of leucine. I think it was within an hour of that resistance training bout, either before or after. So basically, very practical question here, which is if I'm having some protein in close proximity to a workout and we're looking at muscle protein synthesis in the hours that follow, does the leucine content of that protein really matter in terms of the protein synthesis response? And then they also, in order to be included, the studies had to look at kind of they had to take repeated measurements of blood leucine levels to see, okay, maybe the amount ingested isn't that critical, but maybe the magnitude of that spike in blood levels is really critical. So ultimately, what I want to do is just lay the overview of the results out here, and then we can kind of chat and discuss and talk about some of the more practical applications. But when they were looking at the leucine dose in the meal that you ingested, so not looking at blood levels yet, just the amount in the food you're consuming, basically they found that it really wasn't particularly predictive of, the amount of leucine in your protein source wasn't very predictive of the rate of muscle protein synthesis that was observed over the first 2 hours after it was ingested. Now, some folks will look at this paper and say, but you got to look closer, because if they look over the full 6-hour time period, there actually was a significant relationship. Higher leucine in the meal was predictive of higher rates of muscle protein synthesis. However, if you look at the figure in the paper, this relationship is very, very, very weak. The R-squared value, basically the percentage of protein synthesis response that we would attribute to leucine dose or explain by the leucine dose, was 0.05. So 5% of the variation in muscle protein synthesis, which is very, very, very little, is actually explained by the leucine dose that was consumed. And if you look even deeper, what you find is that relationship, as weak as it is driven basically entirely by the cohorts including untrained older adults. And Helms has written about this before many times, very well, by the way. But when we look at older folks who are untrained, a lot of times they have a high level of kind of chronic systemic inflammation. And it can lead to a situation where they are not quite as responsive to orally ingested doses of protein. So they're a little bit less responsive to dietary protein. And in some cases, we find that older folks, especially if they're untrained, actually need to consume higher amounts of protein. And this would suggest higher amounts of leucine in order to overcome what is often called anabolic resistance in older folks. So if we're looking specifically at the younger cohorts, and especially the younger folks who are trained, what we find is really a minimal relationship, essentially no relationship between the leucine dose and the magnitude of muscle protein synthesis. And I know some folks are going to say, well, all the protein sources I eat, when I have a meal, I'm either going to have 2.7 or 3 or 3.3 grams of leucine. So maybe they're just all sufficient, right? Maybe they're all over what we would practically see. But that's not the case. If you look at the range of leucine doses in this figure, I mean, they go from extremely minimal all the way up to there's at least one dose that's over 8 grams of leucine. And all throughout this spectrum, you see that there is tremendous variability when you look at the relationship between the leucine dose and the rate of muscle protein synthesis. So the kind of main take home there is maybe a slight relationship, specifically if you're an older, untrained person. And even then, it is not a very strong relationship at all. Now, a lot of folks say, but that's not really what we care about, right? We need to look at the blood levels. So maybe that leucine threshold stuff isn't legit, but the leucine trigger, that's got to be legit for sure. Now, unsurprisingly, there was a correlation between the leucine dose that people ingested and the peak leucine concentration in their blood after they consumed it, right? You eat more leucine, you have a bigger spike in blood leucine. So they did go to the effort of confirming that, which is good to see. It's always nice to know that based on the data, make sure nothing weird's going on. But when they looked at the relationship between peak plasma leucine concentrations and the rate of muscle protein synthesis, the slope of the line was actually negative. Okay, so slightly, very, very slight relationship. I almost already regret bringing that up because it's a meaningless trend. Okay, so the R-squared value is 0.02. 2% of the variation is explained by peak plasma leucine responses, which is functionally nothing, and the p-value was not statistically significant. So the appropriate interpretation of that result is there was just not a relationship between plasma leucine responses and the rate of muscle protein synthesis. So I want to address one big caveat that I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about, which is the fact that this is looking at the first 6 hours after a bout of resistance training. So a lot of folks are going to say, okay, I get that resistance training has this really robust stimulus when it comes to muscle protein synthesis, and especially in the first few hours after training. So maybe the effect of training is so big that we're not really seeing this leucine effect in the first meal. But I eat a lot of meals, and maybe I only train a muscle group once or twice a week. So surely over, once that immediate muscle protein synthesis response of training wears off, that's where the leucine is going to start to make a really big impact. But we can actually challenge that based on data that were already available before this meta-analysis. I can think of at least a few really good papers where they have compared, 2 different protein interventions in longitudinal trials, looking at changes in strength and changes in hypertrophy over time. And you can look at really marked differences in terms of the leucine dose that's delivered. And in some cases, some of the papers even report plasma leucine responses or blood leucine responses. And what we find is, any way you slice it, when we are giving folks plenty of protein, even if the leucine dose isn't particularly high, and they are eating at least 3 meals a day with plenty of protein, and they're lifting hard, the amount of leucine, that discrepancy between one intervention and the other, whether it's the dietary leucine ingested or the peak plasma responses of leucine, it just doesn't seem to make a measurable or detectable difference in these longer term studies. And a great example of that, one of the areas where this comes up a lot is, I remember when I first started eating a more plant-based diet, people said, that's fine. You could get your protein, but you're really screwed because a lot of those protein sources have super low leucine per gram. So you're going to have to eat all this extra protein to try to make up for it. And, what we have seen in more recent trials is that just doesn't pan out. When they look at, a totally vegan diet versus an omnivorous diet, and they match total protein, and the vegan diet people on the vegan diet are consuming considerably less essential amino acids and less leucine, they still tend to ultimately end up leading to similar gains over time, whether you're looking at strength gains or hypertrophy. So that's been a really exciting area of research lately, kind of debunking a lot of our previous thoughts about exactly how much we should be worrying about, things like protein quality scores and specific leucine doses per serving when we kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture, which is I'm eating plenty of protein, I'm having at least a few meals a day, I'm lifting hard. What we find based on this newer evidence is, despite the mechanistic findings, which are true, when we start to put that, when we take it out of the lab mouse, or we take it out of the context where a lot of this stuff was verified in humans, which is basically, Helms, I'm sure we've both talked about this many times in the past. When people make the argument that you need to be really micromanaging your protein timing and the dosage and the exact leucine amount, if they're not leaning on rodent data, they're usually leaning on human data that is gathered in a pretty specific set of circumstances. It's usually someone who shows up for a study, they did an overnight fast, and for the few hours that they're there in the laboratory, they are only consuming whey protein or some similar protein shake on a completely empty stomach with no other foods interacting. They're not doing resistance training. And researchers do that for good reason. These folks are not dummies. They know that they want to really isolate the muscle protein synthesis impact of the dietary intervention that they're studying. It's kind of like a proof of concept. Does this leucine stuff matter in a vacuum? And that's where this conversation gets challenging, because on the surface, it looks like I'm saying, hey, we debunked all that crap about leucine. We didn't. That stuff is as true today as it was a year ago, and certainly as true as it was in 2012. The problem is when you start layering in the contextual factors of how we apply that information, a lot of those details get lost in the wash, and we end up kind of leaning back toward the pretty basic protein guidance that a lot of folks like Helms and I and you, Omar, have been parroting for a long time, which is maybe don't worry so much about, little granular differences in leucine. Eat plenty of protein throughout the day, split it throughout the day sensibly, at least 3 or 4 servings if you can manage it. And a lot of those other factors kind of get, they kind of work themselves out as long as you're either eating high quality protein sources or just a diversity of protein sources. And I know folks on plant-based diets, the minute that you kind of change over as a lifter, people act like you need to create some kind of spreadsheet to have these perfectly complementary protein sources. In reality, it's like if you're eating meals that anyone else in the world has ever eaten, like if the meal you're eating is part of a cuisine, you probably have some complementary protein sources mixed in there, or some protein sources that are reasonably high quality.
Man, Eric, I think you did a great job with that. And I've been moving my laptop away from the mic, not to show my arms, although that's a nice side benefit, but because my fan has been spinning up the more you've talked. I think you're breaking the brain of my laptop at the very least, and I think potentially some of the listeners, because I remember having these cognitive wrestles in my own brain, like some people are having, where they're struggling to understand what you front-loaded with. Like, these mechanistic studies are true, but this. And I do think it's a difficult challenge. And I think I actually remember the study for me that was a game changer when I was doing my master's, which was in a protein-related area. And I was looking it up while you were talking. So I remember it had a profound effect on me. I remember the last name is Pikowski. There's a study by Pikowski back in 2008 where they measured 3 things: actual changes in lean body mass, muscle protein synthesis, total fractional rate, and they also measured nitrogen balance. And none of the 3 things agreed with the proposed directionality and agreement you'd expect between them. For very brief context, out of the macronutrients, proteins are the only nitrogen-containing macronutrient. So you can measure nitrogen balance, and it gives you a gross aggregate idea of whether or not you're gaining, losing, or not either losing or gaining air nitrogen balance. And that should track the same direction as, you think gains in hypertrophy. But it doesn't necessarily, because there's a whole lot more on your body than skeletal muscle. Okay. Likewise, everything you just said about muscle protein synthesis, yes, it is a snapshot. And then we have the actual change in lean body mass that we derive from, DEXA or what have you. So this study, they basically took two different groups, one consuming 0.9 grams per kilogram of protein, one consuming 1.8. They jacked up their activity level, so they were doing a bunch of cardio, and they put them on a 1,000 calorie per day deficit for 7 days, and they saw what happened. And in the group that was consuming higher protein, they had a positive nitrogen balance, but they lost some muscle mass. And there was no change in their muscle protein synthesis compared to any of the other groups or within before they started ramping it up or going on a deficit. So we had one that showed no change, one that showed a drop, and one that showed an up. And the one that we actually care about that's relevant is the change in lean body mass, at least for the context of our listeners. And I had a really tough time reconciling that until I read some of the discussion and I thought about it. And the authors, because you have to, when you get weird-ass results, you got to talk about it in the discussion, had to explain how much nitrogen is in the body, the different rates that you lose it at from different tissues, like the turnover rates in the gut versus the muscle. They had to talk about the assumptions that are built into nitrogen balance, that we're losing it through sweat, we're losing it through urine, we're losing it through feces, and hell, you're even losing it from like skin contact on the wall or wearing abrasive clothing, or if you shower with a loofah. Like there's a lot of ways to lose nitrogen, and we're only actually collecting urine and estimating everything else. And they talked about how the process of actually gaining or losing lean body mass is multiple days, weeks, or sometimes months when we look at these, 12-week study and they gained 2 kilograms of lean body mass. It didn't all happen right at the end when they measured. Yet a muscle protein synthesis measurement is a snapshot of that in the grand scheme of things, hours of long measurement. Some of the studies that we are basing our entire concept of how does protein operate in the body are 4 to 12 hours long. So we have to really think about the difference between what questions these studies are asking and what questions they can actually answer, instead of making some of these leaps, because when we understand how something works on a very basic level, it doesn't necessarily inform what we should do in the real world. And I can give so many parallels in exercise science, it's not even funny. ATP, yes, it is the currency of life. It is the way we recharge our batteries and move, and it's the way we expend and do things, and we need it. ATP supplementation doesn't really pan out for a lot of reasons. Yes, there's a growth hormone response post-exercise, but it lasts for a very short time period. And it's not the same thing as going through puberty. And it's not the same thing as taking exogenous growth hormone. It's not the same thing as taking a 30-second rest period. So there's so many times where we've trod this same philosophical error-laden path of epistemology where we think that maybe this is the way we do it. And we get the sometimes well-meaning and sometimes charlatan-esque pitch of here's mechanism, here's the thing I'm selling you, here's the thing I think, and let's go directly to the applied nature. But because they're on different time scales, different units, and completely different aspects, one is a tree and one's the forest of the picture we're looking at, it simply cannot inform us what to do. And it's not the purpose of this research. It's not what it's intended to do. And until we can actually show that these things are entirely coupled over a reasonable time scale that we can measure them, they never will be. But they were never intended to. So I think I just want to I wanted to put that out there because I know there's so many people who were like me in 2012 when I was writing my thesis. And they're just like, well, how could these things both be true? Because I understand this is how it works. Therefore, you do this because that's how it works. And you get this outcome because that's how it works. But if you don't get that outcome, then how can that be how it works? And you go round and round and round. But I think ultimately how something works on the molecular level doesn't take into the incredibly complex physiology operating in a dynamic system that results in you growing over time. I mean, if you think about it, in an 8-week study, you gained 2 kilograms of muscle mass, and you measured for 4 hours at 3 time points what your muscle protein synthesis were. How can that measurement take into account that those 2 days where you got 4 hours of sleep? Or the fact that in the last week of the study, maybe you were training closer to failure versus not? They can't. But we know that matters. So I think holding those things all together might be really helpful for the people who are struggling to reconcile, these discrepancies. So I just want to chime in there because honestly, nothing to add in terms of the content. You crushed it. But I do know that it is a very challenging thing for some people to go, well, if this is true, then this must be true, but that's not true, but that is true. And then, repeat it ad nauseum, and eventually they just go, well, screw science. And I don't think we want to do that. We just need to put the different types of science into the right category. And mechanistic, basic / bench work is not the same as applied / translational work. And until you really can draw a direct connection in the data to them and quantify it, it is a bit of a fool's errand to try to have one lead to the other. And by that, I mean the mechanism lead to practice.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm really glad that you brought that up because that's a point that I've been harping on in a lot of my work in the last year or two, which is the fact that muscle protein synthesis itself isn't even very predictive of muscle growth over time. And so what that means in the context of this paper about leucine is by making muscle protein synthesis the outcome, they're actually setting the bar pretty low. Like to try to correlate it with muscle protein synthesis should be considerably easier than correlating it with total protein balance, which should be way easier than actual gross hypertrophy over time, looking at the size of the whole muscle, right? So you could say, okay, well, we'll look at synthesis, or maybe we'll look at the combination of synthesis and breakdown and look at total balance. And even those are just rough proxies for actually building real contractile muscle tissue over time. So even if this paper did find that leucine was super predictive of muscle protein synthesis, you could still go in and say, well, we're looking at protein synthesis immediately after a workout. Most of these folks are untrained. Muscle damage immediately increases muscle protein synthesis just because you need to fix the proteins that are damaged immediately after the workout. And so even if they had these crystal clear correlations, you could still say this is very weak evidence for the idea that we're actually looking at something that relates to long-term muscle hypertrophy. So that's a fantastic point. And when you were mentioning the paper that kind of first made you realize that there was some more complication here, your original mechanistic theories, there needed to be some other elements at play. For me, I kind of had a similar realization when someone was kind of explaining to me in an online conversation, how to use mechanistic information related to muscle protein synthesis. And they're like, well, so this study shows that we maximize muscle protein synthesis by 20 grams of protein. And 20 grams wasn't any worse than 40. So you should have 20 grams when you eat protein. And I said, cool. And they said, and we know that you can only do that a certain number of times per day because of that refractory period between doses. And so, and they even said this dose, we have this study over here that says you don't even need to scale it up based on body mass. People who weigh a lot, people who weigh a little, 20 grams maximized it for both of them. Now, not all the studies show this, but they were kind of walking me through it. And I said, so why would any human being ever eat more than 100 grams of protein a day? Because if you're maximizing the stimulus at 20 grams, regardless of how big you are, and you can only do it every 3 hours or so, maybe you can, have a really long day and really be careful about your timing and get 120 grams of protein a day. And that would be for someone who's a 280-pound IFBB pro bodybuilder. At a certain point, you say there's got to be more than these kind of reduced, simplified, mechanistic rules that we're kind of compounding on one another. And it's the same thing where, like you said, you start putting some of these pieces together, and it's not that you are refuting the validity of the mechanism, but you're saying, okay, the mechanism helps us understand kind of the basic principles of how this stuff operates in a vacuum. But the crazy thing about our body, definitely not a vacuum. And that's where things start to get a lot more complicated.
No, well said. I think, Omar, I'd love to get your take on where people are at with protein, because sometimes I think it's been well settled for a long time. People are kind of been in a space maybe since 2012 where they're like, all right, so we didn't need to eat 2 grams per pound, but high protein is still generally good. Maybe a gram per pound's overkill now, but there's enough big dudes who say like that's still probably a decent proxy, and that's close enough to the science. So I'm just going to do that, and you guys can stop theory wanking. Is you think that's a generally accurate view of like the space?
Theory? Do you say theory wanking?
Yes.
Yeah. Did you just come up with that?
No.
Oh,
I think I'm just Kiwi now.
Oh,
So,
is that? No, I like it though. Just in the sense,
yeah.
I think we all were around during a time that can only be described in the fitness space as a revolution in terms of knowledge and previous notions being challenged. And to your point, Eric, probably around like, I don't know, I would say 2010, 11, 12, maybe even a little bit more, because remember after 2012 into 2013, there were the macro wars, right? Like flexible dieting and so on and so forth. I would say like probably realistically by like 2016 to 2017, protein was its role. There's a rigidity in terms of the knowledge that, okay, these are truthisms that are generally accepted by everyone. There's a scattershot of people that have gotten decent results that are not being challenged by the quote unquote evidence-based gang of ranges of what they're saying. Either, let's say it's like, if we're talking grams per pound of body weight or whatever, it's like 0.7, 0.8, not a 0.9, 1, 1.1, 1. Like this range that it's like, it's acceptable enough that, and people would attest. I really unfortunately do think, and I'll give a parallel example. There's been a whole resurgence on the conversation surrounding power building, which is an entirely other episode. But just the idea of what it is, what its function would be for, the validity of that training approach, what one should do. Now, power building we're talking about since 2000, like Lane Norton, like giving a shout out to Lane Norton again with like power building for over a decade. And that feels almost like it operates in a cycle, but that's considerably more complex. We're talking about like protein, one macronutrient, how it's tied to your body weight, so on and so forth. But I do think, Eric, to your point, the next logical step, that's why there's BCAAs kind of like in parallel of the conversation. But then it's like, okay, if we know protein is important, then what Trexler said, I think what lasted a little longer were the types of protein. All that to say. So yeah, by now it's almost like an insult if someone wants to come up with like fitness content and talk about how much protein one should take on the hierarchy of knowledge for the modern like fitness participant in the space. That's like level 1. Let's say there's like 5 levels. It's probably like a level 1. Whereas in 2012, I'd rank it like a level 3, like worthy of debate, worthy of discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at best it seems like a side conversation that is related to the carnivore plant-based diet thing now, because they will therefore have a high or low protein bias and they will have a colored view of it. But because it's been so entrenched that most people in the fitness space are like, yo, science guys, call me when it changes. Like I get you're talking about it. I get a new study came out, but give me a call when I actually should change my protein intake, because it's been 10 years. And let me just say, as someone who's been studying protein for 11 years, like actually studying it, I get it. And I think we're in an interesting era now where I would just encourage the listener to humor us a little bit, because we're trying to understand specifically the relationship of protein to some of these things in both a clinical and applied sense, in more sports performance basis or body composition basis. Because when we can uncover what exactly is going on here and what factors do matter, because even though the applied outcome of eat enough protein to spread it out is very simple, and I do not think it will change, understanding what's actually going on under the hood could potentially change treatment for people with muscle wasting diseases, interventions at older ages, and potentially us doing things that don't waste people's time with protein supplementation and having an easier time refuting when something comes out that doesn't make any sense. Like there had to be a lot of work done to get people to stop taking BCAAs because we took this mechanistic path, right? So it's one thing to just say, hey, the studies on BCAA do not show a benefit, but they can keep going back and then saying, yeah, but all these leucine studies, leucine is so important, branched chain amino acids are so important, and they can fight us tooth and nail with us focusing on applied outcome, them focusing on mechanistic study, and to the layperson watching, it's just study versus study, and it's like, I hate you science guys, right? So I think that's frustrating. But when we have a consensus and we understand specifically how the link between mechanisms to applied to practice work, which we're still working on, and this paper is very important for, because this paper is actually going to shake some boots among the people who do mechanistic research for them to go, okay, hold on, then there's got to be something else that we missed, right? The Stu Phillips of the world are going to be like, oh, I'm discomforted. And Stu, if you're listening, I hope you're not too discomforted. I am joking. And I do appreciate your work.
Actually, I think that I've seen a lot of his tweets lately where he's really asserting like, hey guys, training is what stimulates muscle growth. Like the protein stuff matters. And like, they've done a lot of that work in his lab, but he's like, don't forget that training is what really makes the big difference here. The protein stuff is the icing, not the cake.
And that's a really great point. So let's say all this stuff is true, but we have a high level of precision on a variable that has a low level of impact. So let's say the overall impact of what makes you grow is 100%. And messing in the minutia of protein beyond just getting like a sufficient amount, like 1.2, 1.3 from any source, can only explain 10% of it. Even if we understand, 100% of that, it's going to get washed away in a lot of the different changes that occur in real world research. So I think that's a really good point, Trex. But just to kind of give a little bit to the audience of why it's important to understand this is once we do hone in and get this, it enables new pathways of research that we don't yet get. And, they may or may not be relevant to you, but it also makes it a much easier job for us to deal with charlatans, to more fine-tune practical implementation and potentially help more people. So it's not purposeless. It's not just us going back to the well and being like, all right, what are we going to talk about this week? And Omar's like, I don't know, give me a dart, throws at the board. And, there's protein intermittent fasting or a few other things that, we just have to talk about every 6 months because we forgot. It's not it. This is, I think, a really interesting thing for anyone who's involved in the practice with science. And hey, history, science, culture, we're assuming that you guys have some interest in science for science sakes. And if you don't, well, stop following us. Get out of here. All right. Is that the way we get more likes and listens?
No, we had that whole plan. We were going to the top, remember?
Okay, Brandon, cut that out. Cut that out, Brandon.
Brandon,
cut that out.
We recruited Trexler Helms. So we had one person in the squad that could emphatically fight. Okay, the
listen,
person...
now you see why we recruited Trexler, because I keep saying things like that.
Yeah.
Well, Helms, and I think, on top of everything that you mentioned, which like it's important for us to figure out these mechanistic relationships and how they actually apply in all those different clinical scenarios and things like that. I think the thing that keeps me really engaged with this work is when I first got into it back when, now people are kind of fatigued about it because back in the day we were trying to find optimal. How close can we get to optimal? It was always trying to drive toward optimal. I think a lot of us, as we've been following it, were a little bit disappointed with the giant window of what constitutes optimal in terms of protein strategies. But now the reason that I'm still really enthusiastic about this work and interested in it is I want to test those boundaries. I actually want to know, because we've all been in these different studies as we follow them, we've been kind of aiming for what is the center of optimal. But now I think we're exploring, well, what are the boundaries of optimal? Like how suboptimal can we go with it to meet our preferences before we're actually making a genuine sacrifice or trade-off, And so for me, I think that is in some ways more important than finding the center of the optimal range, because once you know the boundaries of the optimal range, you know which overall dietary patterns are suitable or, which ones maybe are not so suitable or represent major trade-offs where you're really leaving gains on the table. So like for me, my preference actually is to eat 2 meals a day. It fits my schedule better. It helps me regulate my appetite a little bit better. I usually my appetite would put me in a little bit of a state of weight gain. So I need to curtail that a little bit. And so for someone like me, it's very informative to know, okay, I'm on a mostly vegan diet and I like to eat 2 meals a day. Can we make that work? And if not, how far from that optimal range are we? So yeah, I think exploring the boundaries of optimal is in many ways more helpful and more practical than trying to find where the center point of that range is.
Brandon, let's also cut out where Eric Trexler says he's on a 2 meal per day vegan diet. If we want to go to the top, I think that'll probably just between the two of us, we're really trying to hurt the viewership here a lot.
Rogan was interested for a little bit in a few of the topics, especially that's why I keep throwing in fighting references, because that would intrigue him. Oh, here are like 2 exercise scientists that also lift, but are also down with like discussing whether a grizzly bear versus, like a silverback gorilla would win. Then he starts hearing some of this wooey stuff, and I don't know. Nonetheless, I will say, in defense of both of you, I think this is very important. I think that Iron Cult does understand this. I think essentially what you guys do, you understand these things so they don't have to. I don't mean anything by that, but a lot of the information presented here is it's pre-digested for them, right? And that's important. And I think it's not only important, it's necessary in the space, because we made a joke, well, not a joke, but in some circles, let's say, talking about skepticism, like they talk about, the God that exists in the cracks. So anything that cannot be explained. But I want to say in the fitness space, the bros exist in the cracks. And the cracks are the spaces that are not, what's funny, Eric knows that to be incredible. As soon as it says it's true, man, where essentially what it is, if the whack-a-mole has not occurred, where it's basically in the space, they don't need to understand that leucine, in quotations, is not important, why that discussion is had, but they just need to know that it's not a topic being discussed because no one of note thinks it's of value, and so they turn away from that. And when we talk about the bros exist in the cracks, I think the cracks exist because within every single lifter is the desire treks in some way, shape, or form to be optimal or to be more than. That's kind of intrinsic, sort of within a lot of different fitness journeys. And so anything that gives us a potential leg up, or we see a pathway, like, could this be the answer? So we talk about protein, then we talk about the amino acids.
Hope, Omar.
Right? And
is it in leucine? Could I have a leucine supplement that would get me there?
Yeah. And so I would say on TikTok, and this is no shade, that's why we have Helms here, okay, to do the dance for the boys. So boys and girls, so they're interested, so they're hip, they can understand. Eric does the dance as he explains it, but the optimal movement craze that kind of took over in some of those spaces where it's like, oh, you're doing a bicep curl this way. Well, if you supinate just 3% more, what will happen? Like the inner head of the bicep, ABCD, and it's the whole idea that bros kind of exist. And that's more complex to debunk that, but there's many different moving parts. But bros exist kind of in the cracks. And that's not even a fault, I would say, necessarily. We're not talking about companies, but of bros. It's just the general desire, I think, of the space to find things that will give a competitive edge. So while this might seem redundant to like our group, where you said, Eric, about either protein or whatever, like leucine, some of these things in quotations have been known, which means that the consensus amongst the establishment, the evidence-based community is as such. I think it's still very valuable to revisit it. And as you said, to kind of like reframe it so people understand, how do you even reach these conclusions? Because now if you're a 2023 fitness individual, right, 2024 soon to be, it's like you enter the space and it's assumed, like you find like, oh, Lucy is like, someone's like, oh, it's not important. You're like, oh, cool. Like, and that's that oh, cool. And the leucine, it's not important, represents basically like 15 years of research summarized into a neat like declaration that is not like, not without lacking nuance, but it's accurate enough for people to go on. So I actually think it's very important. I think the cult understands that.
That's well said, Omar. And it's like, it kind of goes back to our whole conversations we've had about how it's not bro science versus science. It's the bro in me that brought me to science because I wanted to turn over more stones. And science has helped me figure out which stones are worth turning over, what is yet to be turned over. And we're trying to impart that on everyone else, right? We're inoculating. I'm not going to say vaccine because I'll lose half our audience. We've already done that between the two comments we had previously. We're going to inoculate by some other means that is
hypnotize.
Better. Yeah, exactly. Prevent bad things from happening in the future so when you do get exposed to potentially, hey, this is a stone to turn over, you're like, no, I'm pretty sure that's not, because I have a finite amount of energy. So I think, great stuff, Eric. I think that was an excellent overview. Then you connected it back. I hope I teed it up. And then, Omar, you brought us home to connect with the people. I think we did a good job. And I really actually like, even though I made a joke right after you said it at Trex, or I want to go back, just rewind it. like, yeah, exploring the boundaries is a really good thing too, instead of getting a point estimate, because we do trend towards specific black and white univariate relationships. In reality, it's almost always continuums and ranges. And having those, it enables us to put certain things on autopilot, increase adherence, and broaden the scope of what people can do in their lives to still achieve these goals, which makes the community broader, and it makes it be that there's less dropouts and less people falling by the wayside. So no, I totally agree. That is a fantastic point. It's another reason to explore this, in addition to the whole inoculation conversation that we had.
Yeah, and in the spirit of boundaries, let me put a little bow on this by creating some boundaries for interpretation, right? So I've tried to put some caveats in here, and I want to sprinkle one more in here. So the takeaway here, as I've said previously, is not that leucine doesn't matter for muscle protein synthesis, but what it does kind of hint at is if you're someone who's lifting weights and you're eating enough protein throughout the day, you are probably almost by default getting enough, right? So if you went out of your way to somehow construct a leucine-free diet, not going to happen in practice, that would not be ideal, right? The leucine still matters, but it doesn't need to be thought about, most likely. So if you're in there putting together a meal and it's got enough protein in it, you probably don't even need to check the leucine content, and you certainly don't need to say, I heard that this protein source had 2.7 and that one only has 2.4, because that definitely doesn't matter. So the boundaries, does leucine matter? Yes. But how wide are the boundaries in terms of the doses that are going to get the job done? It appears that if you're lifting, they're pretty broad, and so broad that you probably don't need to put much thought into the leucine content of your individual meals.
Well said. Oxygen also matters to make sure that we're making gains, but we don't need to prescribe how many breaths per hour you take. Love it.
But people still sell oxygen that you can bring into the gym, so...
Bad example, because maybe we do need to have an episode on oxygen. Let's put that one on the dartboard as well when we go back to the well.
Well, gents, I would say this has been another fantastic power episode of the Iron Cult as we ascend even further towards the tippity top. Like, we're right there, but there's always challengers. And that's why Trex is here, because he's shooting for the single leg first. Eric is staring at them menacingly, hoping that, like, Trex, take care of them this neck. And then me, I'm just going to swan dive off. If it's like 1, 2, then it's like, see you guys later. And then it's on to the obelisk I go with Dr. Connor Heffernan. But nonetheless, we have finished another episode. We appreciate everyone for listening to this episode. You could go ahead, as we said before at the beginning, and leave a rating review on iTunes. It helps us out. We might be rebranding, now that we have a new co-host, this podcast to Sex with Eric's. We will see. It's a brave new world. We're entering our 5th year. What does that mean? Actually, hold on, 6th year, right? If we're episode 2, almost 2, that does mean 5 years. Yeah.
So we started in early 2019.
Some people would say it's the first year, but
it's the first year of a brave new world.
Yes. First year of the brave new world. So go ahead and leave that rating review. Typically, as you just heard, the 2 reviews, people will give 5 stars. We appreciate every single one of you. We'll catch you in that next episode. Insert date here from now until the end of time. Until next time,